Maria Santos never imagined that her morning jog through the streets of Bogotá would change her life forever. The 28-year-old physical therapist had always been athletic, her reflexes sharp from years of playing volleyball in college. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen on that humid Tuesday morning in March 2019. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Colombian capital as Maria laced up her running shoes outside her modest apartment building. She had moved to this neighborhood 6 months earlier, drawn by the affordable rent and its proximity to the rehabilitation center where she worked. The area wasn't the safest, but Maria had grown up in worse parts of the city. She knew how to keep her head down and avoid trouble. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Maria noticed the unusual quiet that had settled over the usually bustling street. Normally, vendors would be setting up their stalls by now, and the aroma of fresh bread from the bakery would fill the air. Instead, an eerie silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters circling overhead. Maria's neighbor, Don Carlos, an elderly man who ran a small grocery store, was hurriedly pulling down his metal shutters. When he saw her, his weathered face creased with worry. "Mija, you shouldn't be going out today," he warned, using the affectionate term he reserved for the younger people in the neighborhood. "There's been trouble brewing since yesterday. The police have been asking questions about some men who've been staying in the building across the street." She paused, considering his words, but the competitive spirit that had driven her through years of athletic training wouldn't let her skip her daily run. "I'll be careful, Don Carlos. I'm just going to the park and back. Nothing will happen." The old man shook his head, muttering a prayer under his breath as he watched her stretch against a lamppost. Maria had always been stubborn, a trait that had served her well in her profession, but sometimes worried those who cared about her. As she began her run, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from the darkened windows of the surrounding buildings. The neighborhood felt different today, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She picked up her pace, eager to reach the relative safety of the park where other joggers and dog walkers would provide some comfort through their presence. The park was eerily empty when she arrived. Usually, she would encounter at least a dozen other early morning exercisers, but today the paths were deserted except for a few stray dogs searching for scraps. The playground equipment stood silent, its colorful swings moving gently in the morning breeze like ghostly reminders of children's laughter. Maria decided to cut her run short. Something was definitely wrong, and every instinct she had developed growing up in a tough neighborhood was screaming at her to get home. As she turned to retrace her steps, she heard the rumble of vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were moving slowly down the street that bordered the park. Her heart began to race, but not from the exercise. These weren't ordinary vehicles. They moved with the deliberate pace of hunters stalking prey, and Maria realized with growing dread that she might have walked into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. She ducked behind a large tree, using its thick trunk to shield herself from view. Through the gaps in the foliage, she watched as the vehicles stopped near the entrance to her neighborhood. Men began emerging from the SUVs, and even from her distance, Maria could see they were armed. These weren't police officers or military personnel. Their movements were too casual, too comfortable with the weapons they carried. Drug dealers, she realized with a chill. The kind of men who had turned parts of Bogotá into war zones, who settled disputes with bullets, and treated innocent civilians as collateral damage. Maria's mind raced as she tried to figure out her next move. Her apartment was in the direction the men were heading, but there was no other way home that wouldn't take her through even more dangerous territory. She was trapped, caught between the unknown threat ahead and the certainty that staying in the park alone would leave her completely vulnerable. She pulled out her phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The towers in this area had been unreliable lately, and now when she needed them most, they had failed her completely. Panic began to set in as she realized just how alone and exposed she was. The sound of gunfire suddenly erupted from the direction of her neighborhood. Not the single shots of street crime, but the sustained bursts of automatic weapons. Maria pressed herself against the tree trunk, her training as a physical therapist kicking in as she forced herself to control her breathing and think clearly. She knew she had to move. Staying in one place would only make her an easier target if the violence spread to the park. Using the trees as cover, she began making her way toward the back exit of the park, hoping she could circle around and approach her building from a different angle. As she moved from tree to tree, Maria heard voices speaking in urgent whispers. She froze, realizing that some of the armed men had entered the park. They were spread out, searching for something or someone. The way they moved suggested they were looking for a specific person, not just clearing the area. Maria's blood ran cold as she overheard fragments of their conversation. They were looking for a woman who had witnessed something she shouldn't have, a woman who lived in her building. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. The questions the police had been asking, according to Don Carlos. The unusual activity in the building across the street. Someone had seen something they shouldn't have, and now these men were conducting a deadly manhunt. But they didn't know exactly who they were looking for. That much was clear from their conversations. They had a general description, but in a neighborhood where many young women lived, that wouldn't narrow it down much. Maria realized with growing horror that any woman they encountered might become a victim of their paranoid violence. She continued moving through the park, staying low and using every piece of cover available. Her years of playing sports had given her good body awareness and the ability to move quietly, skills she never imagined would become a matter of life and death. As she neared the back entrance of the park, Maria saw more vehicles arriving. The situation was escalating rapidly, and she realized that what had started as a targeted operation was becoming something much larger and more chaotic. The sound of sirens in the distance suggested that law enforcement was finally responding, but they were still too far away to help her immediate situation. Maria made it to the park's rear entrance and carefully peered around the corner. The street beyond appeared empty, but she had learned not to trust appearances. These men were professionals, and they would have positioned lookouts at strategic points. She was about to make a run for it when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Someone was coming through the park, moving in her direction. Maria looked around frantically for a better hiding spot and saw a maintenance shed about 20 feet away. If she could reach it without being seen, she might be able to hide until the danger passed. Taking a deep breath, Maria sprinted toward the shed, keeping low and trying to make as little noise as possible. She reached it just as the footsteps grew closer and pressed herself against its back wall, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid it could be heard. The footsteps paused near where she had been hiding just moments before. She heard the rustle of leaves and the soft sound of someone examining the ground. They were tracking her, following the path she had taken through the park. Maria closed her eyes and tried to think. She was a physical therapist, trained to help people heal from injuries, not someone equipped to deal with armed criminals. But she was also a survivor, someone who had grown up in tough circumstances and learned to adapt quickly to dangerous situations. The footsteps began moving again, but this time they were heading away from Maria. Burst from behind the maintenance shed and ran toward what she hoped was safety. Her legs pumped with the rhythm she had perfected over years of training. But this time adrenaline and fear drove her forward rather than the joy of exercise. The empty street stretched before her like a pathway through a nightmare, each shadow potentially concealing another threat. She had made it about halfway down the block when she heard shouts behind her. They had spotted her. The peaceful morning had erupted into chaos, and Maria found herself at the center of it all. The sound of running footsteps echoed off the concrete buildings, growing louder as her pursuers gained ground. Maria's mind raced as fast as her feet. She knew this neighborhood well enough to understand that most of the side streets would lead her into dead ends or areas where she would be even more exposed. Her only real chance was to reach the main avenue where there might be traffic, witnesses, and hopefully some sign of law enforcement. Behind her, she could hear the men communicating with each other through radio devices. Their voices were calm and professional, which somehow made them even more terrifying than if they had been shouting. These weren't angry criminals acting on impulse. They were organized, methodical, and they had resources. As Maria rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a woman about her age who was hurrying in the opposite direction. The woman's face was pale with fear, and she grabbed Maria's arm with desperate strength. "They're looking for someone," The woman whispered urgently. Someone who saw them moving weapons last night. They think it was one of us from the building. They're going door to door, and they're not asking nicely. Maria's heart sank as she realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. An entire building full of innocent people was under threat because someone had witnessed something they shouldn't have. The men pursuing her weren't just trying to silence a witness. They were trying to eliminate anyone who might potentially be that witness. "Where can we go?" Maria asked, looking around frantically for somewhere safe. "There's nowhere," the woman replied, her voice breaking with panic. "They have the whole area surrounded. The police can't get through because they've blocked the main roads. We're trapped." The sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions confirmed the woman's words. Maria could see that they were indeed trapped in an ever-tightening circle of armed men. But giving up wasn't in her nature. Years of competitive sports had taught her that there was always a way to win, even when the odds seemed impossible. "What's your name?" Maria asked the woman. "Carmen," she replied, wiping tears from her eyes. "Carmen, I need you to listen to me. We're going to get through this, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" Carmen nodded, drawing strength from Maria's confidence, even though Maria felt anything but confident herself. Maria led Carmen toward a narrow alley that ran between two apartment buildings. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it would give them a moment to think and plan their next move. As they pressed themselves against the wall, Maria could hear the systematic search continuing around them. The men were being thorough. They were checking every apartment, every rooftop, every possible hiding place. Maria realized that simply hiding wasn't going to be enough. They needed to find a way to actively escape or find help. "Carmen, do you know anyone in this neighborhood who might help us? Someone with a phone that works? Or maybe someone who knows another way out of here?" Carmen thought for a moment, her fear-clouded mind struggling to focus. "There's a man, Senor Rodriguez, who lives in the basement apartment of the building at the end of this alley. He used to be a soldier. If anyone would know what to do, it would be him." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. Maria peered out of the alley and saw that the immediate area was clear. The searchers had moved on to other buildings for the moment. This might be their only chance to move. "Stay low and follow me," Maria whispered to Carmen. "If something happens to me, you keep going to Senor Rodriguez. Don't look back, just run." They crept out of the alley and began making their way toward the building Carmen had indicated. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and every sound made Maria's heart skip a beat. A cat jumping down from a fire escape nearly sent both women diving for cover. They were almost to the building when they heard voices coming from inside it. Maria's blood ran cold as she realized the searchers had already reached this location. Through a ground-level window, she could see shadows moving around inside. Carmen grabbed Maria's arm, her fingernails digging into the skin. "They're in there," she whispered, stating the obvious, but needing to voice her fear. Maria nodded grimly. Their potential safe haven had become another trap. She looked around desperately for alternatives and spotted a fire escape on the building across the street. If they could reach it and climb to the roof, they might be able to move across the connected buildings and find another way down several blocks away. "Change of plan," Maria whispered to Carmen. "We're going up." Carmen looked at the fire escape with obvious terror. "I'm afraid of heights," she admitted. "You're going to be more afraid of what happens if we stay down here," Maria replied with grim honesty. They waited for a break in the patrol patterns and then made a desperate dash across the street. Maria reached the fire escape first and began climbing as quietly as she could, with Carmen close behind. The metal structure groaned softly under their weight, and Maria prayed that the sound wouldn't carry to the searchers below. As they climbed higher, Maria could see the full scope of the operation below them. There were far more men than she had initially realized, and they had indeed surrounded the entire neighborhood. Vehicles blocked every major exit, and armed men patrolled the streets in an organized pattern that would have impressed military strategists. But from her elevated position, Maria could also see something else. In the distance, she spotted a convoy of police vehicles that had stopped several blocks away. They were being held back by the roadblocks, but they were there. Help was coming, even if it couldn't reach them yet. Maria and Carmen reached the roof of the building and crouched behind a large air conditioning unit. From here, they could see across the entire neighborhood and plan their next move. The rooftops stretched out before them like a potential highway to safety, but Maria knew that crossing them would be dangerous and exposed. "Look," Carmen whispered, pointing toward their neighborhood. Maria followed her gaze and saw smoke rising from one of the buildings. The situation was escalating beyond a simple search operation. These men were willing to destroy property and risk innocent lives to achieve their goal. As they watched in horror, Maria realized that they weren't just witnesses anymore. They were survivors of something much larger and more dangerous than they had initially understood. The men below weren't just drug dealers protecting their territory. They were part of something organized and ruthless, something that treated human life as expendable. Maria pulled out her phone again and was surprised to find that she had a weak signal from their elevated position. With trembling fingers, she tried to call the emergency number, but the call wouldn't go through. The network was overloaded or being jammed somehow. "We need to keep moving," Maria told Carmen. "Staying in one place too long is dangerous." They began making their way across the rooftop, moving carefully to avoid creating noise that might give away their position. The sun was getting higher now, and Maria realized that daylight would make them more visible to anyone looking up from the street. As they reached the edge of the building and prepared to cross to the next rooftop, Maria heard something that made her freeze in terror. Footsteps on the fire escape below them. Someone was climbing up. Carmen heard it too, and her face went white with fear. They were trapped on the roof with nowhere to go. The gap to the next building was too wide to jump safely, and going back down would mean walking directly into the arms of their pursuers. Maria looked around frantically for options and spotted a maintenance ladder that led to a higher section of the roof. It wasn't much of a solution, but it might give them a few more minutes to think of something else. They climbed the ladder and found themselves on a small upper section of the roof that housed various mechanical equipment. It provided some cover, but Maria knew it was only a temporary refuge. The footsteps on the fire escape were getting closer. Maria could hear voices now, and she realized that more than one person was climbing up. They had been spotted, and the net was closing again. Carmen was beginning to panic, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Maria grabbed her shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. "Listen to me, Carmen. Whatever happens next, I need you to stay calm and be ready to move fast. We're not giving up." Carmen nodded, trying to draw strength from Maria's determination. The voices were very close now. Maria could hear them discussing search patterns and communication protocols. These men were definitely professionals, and they were very good at what they did. Maria peered around the edge of their hiding spot and saw that Maria held her breath as the armed man completed his scan of the rooftop. His eyes passed over their hiding spot twice before his radio crackled to life, drawing his attention away from their corner. Carmen pressed herself harder against the air conditioning unit, her knuckles white as she gripped Maria's arm. The man spoke into his radio in hushed tones, reporting that the roof appeared clear. Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew their reprieve would be temporary. These men were too thorough to simply take one person's word that an area was secure. As the man began to move across the roof toward the far edge, Maria realized they had a narrow window of opportunity. If they could make it back to the fire escape while he was distracted, they might be able to climb down and find another hiding spot before additional searchers arrived. She motioned for Carmen to follow her, and they began creeping back toward the ladder that led down to the main section of the roof. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and Maria was acutely aware of how exposed they would be if the man turned around. They had almost reached the ladder when disaster struck. Carmen, weakened by fear and exhaustion, missed her footing and knocked over a small piece of debris. The sound wasn't loud, but in the tense silence of the morning, it might as well have been a gunshot. The man spun around immediately, his weapon raised and ready. Maria saw his eyes widen as he spotted them, and she knew their time had run out. Without thinking, she grabbed Carmen's hand and pulled her toward the fire escape, abandoning any attempt at stealth. "Stop!" the man shouted, but Maria and Carmen were already moving. They reached the fire escape and began climbing down as fast as they dared, the metal structure shaking under their rapid descent. Behind them, Maria could hear the man speaking urgently into his radio, calling for backup and reporting their position. She also heard his footsteps as he began pursuing them down the fire escape. Carmen slipped on one of the rungs and nearly fell, but Maria caught her and helped her regain her balance. "Keep going," Maria urged, looking down to see how much farther they had to go. They were still 2 stories above the ground when Maria saw more men emerging from the building below them. They were trapped between the pursuer above and the men waiting below. The fire escape had become a death trap. "This way," Maria said, pulling Carmen toward one of the apartment windows on the 2nd floor. She tried the window and found it unlocked, a stroke of luck in their increasingly desperate situation. They climbed through the window into what appeared to be an empty apartment. The furniture was covered with dust sheets, and it was clear that no one had lived there for some time. Maria prayed that it would remain unoccupied long enough for them to figure out their next move. Carmen collapsed onto a covered chair, her legs shaking from the physical and emotional strain. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're just delaying the inevitable." Maria knelt beside her and spoke firmly but gently. "Carmen, look at me. We've made it this far because we didn't give up. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we're alive, and as long as we're alive, we have a chance." Outside, they could hear the sounds of the search intensifying. Doors were being kicked in, and voices were shouting orders in the building across the street. The systematic hunt was becoming more violent and desperate, which meant the men were under pressure from their superiors to find their target quickly. Maria moved to the apartment's front door and listened carefully. She could hear movement in the hallway, but it was distant. They weren't in the building yet, but it would only be a matter of time before they worked their way through every structure in the area. The apartment they were hiding in offered several advantages. It was on the 2nd floor, which meant they could potentially escape through the window if necessary. It also had multiple rooms, which would give them options if they were discovered. Maria explored the apartment quickly and found that it had a small balcony that faced away from the main search area. From there, she could see a courtyard behind the building that appeared to be temporarily unguarded. "Carmen, come here," she called softly. Carmen joined her on the balcony, and Maria pointed toward the courtyard. "If we can get down there, we might be able to make it to the building on the other side. From there, we could work our way toward the police barricade." Carmen looked at the drop to the courtyard below. It was about 15 feet, not impossible, but dangerous, especially for someone already weakened by stress and fear. "I don't think I can make that jump," Carmen admitted. Maria studied the side of the building and noticed that there were several balconies below them. "We don't have to jump. Look, we can climb down using the balconies. It's risky, but it's better than waiting here to be found." Before Carmen could respond, they heard voices in the hallway outside the apartment. The searchers had reached their building. Maria grabbed Carmen's hand and led her quickly to the balcony. "We have to go now," she whispered urgently. Carmen nodded, her fear of heights overcome by her fear of the men in the hallway. Maria climbed over the balcony railing first, testing her grip and finding handholds on the building's facade. Her years of athletic training served her well as she lowered herself down to the balcony below. Carmen followed more slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Maria could see that she was struggling, but she was fighting through her fear with admirable courage. They had just reached the 1st-floor balcony when they heard the apartment door above them being kicked in. Shouts echoed from the empty rooms as the searchers discovered their temporary hiding place. "The window's open," someone yelled. They went out the window. Maria knew they had only seconds before the men would check the balconies. She and Carmen dropped the remaining 8 feet to the courtyard, landing hard but safely on the packed dirt. The courtyard was small and enclosed, with only one exit that led to an alley behind the building. As they ran toward it, Maria heard footsteps above them and risked a glance upward. A man was leaning over the balcony they had just escaped from, scanning the courtyard. He spotted them just as they reached the alley entrance. Maria heard him shouting into his radio, reporting their position and direction of travel. The hunt was continuing, and their pursuers were getting better at predicting their movements. The alley was narrow and lined with garbage containers and maintenance equipment. It offered some cover, But Maria knew it would also be easy to trap them if the men managed to block both ends. They ran through the alley as quickly as they could, emerging onto another residential street. This area appeared to be outside the initial search perimeter, and Maria felt a moment of hope when she saw normal neighborhood activity. People going about their morning routines, unaware of the drama unfolding just blocks away. But their hope was short-lived. As they tried to blend in with the other pedestrians, Maria noticed a black SUV moving slowly down the street. The men had expanded their search area, and the net was widening. "Act casual," Maria whispered to Carmen. "Just walk normally, and don't make eye contact with anyone in the vehicles." They tried to walk at a normal pace, but both women were disheveled and obviously distressed. Maria realized they stood out like beacons to anyone looking for people who didn't belong. The SUV stopped about half a block ahead of them, and Maria saw men getting out. They weren't being subtle anymore. They were conducting an open manhunt in broad daylight, apparently confident that they could intimidate any potential witnesses. Maria steered Carmen toward a small cafe that was just opening for business. "In here," she said, hoping the owner wouldn't ask questions about their appearance. The cafe was nearly empty except for an elderly man reading a newspaper and a young mother with a small child. Maria and Carmen took a table near the back, trying to make themselves as inconspicuous as possible. The owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached their table. "You ladies look like you've had a rough morning," she observed. "Can I get you something to drink? Some coffee, maybe?" Maria nodded gratefully. "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you. And maybe a phone we could use? It's an emergency." The woman's expression grew concerned. "Of course, Mija. The phone is beta moment stretched like elastic about to snap." Maria watched the man's hand move toward his concealed weapon, and time seemed to slow as adrenaline flooded her system. She could see Carmen frozen in terror beside her, the cafe owner backing away in confusion, and the young mother instinctively pulling her child closer. But instead of drawing a gun, the man pulled out what looked like a small metal sphere. Maria's athletic background had given her excellent vision and quick recognition skills, and she immediately understood what she was looking at. It was a grenade. The man's partner moved to block the cafe entrance while keeping watch on the street outside. They weren't planning to shoot anyone in the crowded cafe. They were planning something much worse. They intended to eliminate everyone in the building to ensure there would be no witnesses to whatever was about to happen. The man holding the grenade pulled the pin with his teeth, a gesture so casual and practiced that it made Maria's stomach turn. He was about to murder innocent people as easily as ordering coffee. "Everyone get down," Maria shouted, but she knew there wasn't enough time for people to react and take cover. The cafe was too small, and there was nowhere to hide from the blast. In that crystalline moment of clarity that sometimes comes in extreme crisis, Maria made a decision that defied every instinct for self-preservation. Instead of diving for cover or trying to flee, she moved toward the man with the grenade. Her volleyball training kicked in with muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. Years of reading the trajectory of balls moving at high speed, of positioning herself to intercept objects flying through the air, had prepared her for this moment without her ever knowing it. The man saw her coming and realized his mistake too late. He had expected panic and chaos, not someone moving toward him with purpose. His surprise cost him the split second he needed to throw the grenade accurately. When he finally released it, his throw was hurried and off-target. Instead of landing in the center of the cafe where it would cause maximum damage, the grenade flew in a high arc toward the back corner where Maria and Carmen had been sitting. But Maria was no longer there. She was airborne, her body stretched in a diving catch that would have impressed her old volleyball coach. Her hands closed around the metal sphere just as it reached the peak of its arc, her fingers instinctively finding the grip that would give her control. The grenade felt warm in her hands, and she could feel the weight of its deadly potential. But she had it, and that meant she could control what happened next. Landing hard on the cafe floor, Maria rolled and came up running toward the front of the establishment. She had perhaps 3 seconds before the device exploded, and she knew exactly what she had to do with them. The man who had thrown the grenade was staring at her in shock, his mouth open in disbelief. His partner was reaching for his own weapon, finally, understanding that their simple elimination job had gone catastrophically wrong. Maria didn't hesitate. With all the force and accuracy she had developed through years of competitive volleyball, she hurled the grenade back toward the front of the cafe. But her target wasn't the interior of the building. She was aiming for the open doorway and the street beyond. The throw was perfect. The grenade sailed through the doorway just as the two men dove for cover behind tables and chairs. Maria grabbed Carmen and the cafe owner, pulling them toward the back of the building and shouting for everyone to get down. The explosion came a heartbeat later, shattering the front windows of the cafe and sending debris flying across the street. But the blast occurred outside the building, and while the damage was extensive, no one inside was killed. Maria's ears were ringing from the explosion, and smoke was filling the cafe, but she could see that everyone was moving. The young mother was crying and holding her child, but they were both alive. The elderly man was shaken but uninjured, and Carmen was staring at Maria with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We have to go," Maria said, her voice sounding strange to her own damaged hearing. "They'll send more people." The explosion had attracted attention from throughout the neighborhood. Maria could hear sirens in the distance, real ones this time, and the sound of running feet on the street outside. But she also heard the familiar sound of vehicles with powerful engines approaching rapidly. The cafe owner, a woman named Isabella as Maria learned later, was moving with surprising efficiency despite the chaos. "There's a back exit through the kitchen," she said, leading them toward the rear of the building. "It connects to the building next door." As they moved through the smoke-filled cafe, Maria saw that one of the men was still alive, but badly injured by the explosion. He was trying to reach his radio, probably to call for help or report what had happened. Maria made another split-second decision that surprised even her. Instead of simply running past the injured man, she stopped and grabbed his radio. "Maria, what are you doing?" Carmen demanded. "We need to get out of here." "In a minute," Maria replied, studying the radio's controls. She had an idea that might help them survive the rest of this ordeal. The radio was already tuned to the frequency the armed men were using to coordinate their search. Maria could hear voices reporting the explosion and requesting instructions. They were confused and angry, uncertain about what had happened and how a simple manhunt had turned into an urban combat situation. Maria keyed the microphone and spoke in the calmest voice she could manage. "This is Maria Santos. I'm the woman you're looking for. I saw what happened last night, and I recorded everything." The radio went silent for several seconds before a gravelly voice responded. "Where are you?" "I'm safe," Maria replied. "And the recording is in a safe place too. If anything happens to me, it goes directly to the authorities and the media." It was a complete bluff. Maria hadn't recorded anything because she hadn't seen anything. She wasn't even sure what the men thought she had witnessed. But her gamble was based on the assumption that they wouldn't want to risk exposure of whatever illegal activity they were trying to conceal. "What do you want?" the voice asked. "I want you to stop this madness," Maria replied. "Stop searching the neighborhood. Stop threatening innocent people. And give me 30 minutes to get to the police barricades safely." Carmen was staring at her in amazement. "You're negotiating with them?" Maria nodded, still holding the radio. She wasn't sure if her bluff would work, but it was buying them time and potentially saving other innocent people from being caught in the violence. The voice on the radio was silent for a long moment before responding. "You have 15 minutes. After that, we resume operations." Maria felt a surge of hope. It wasn't exactly what she had asked for, but it was something. "Deal," she said into the radio. Isabella led them through the kitchen and into a connecting passage that linked several buildings on the block. It was a route that only longtime residents would know about, and it gave them a way to move towards safety without being spotted from the street. As they hurried through the narrow passage, Carmen grabbed Maria's arm. "That was incredible what you did back there. Catching that grenade, throwing it back, I've never seen anything like it." Maria was still processing what had happened herself. The catch and throw had been pure instinct, muscle memory from thousands of hours of athletic training. But using the radio to negotiate with their pursuers had been something else entirely, a calculated risk that could have gotten them all killed. "I just did what felt right," Maria replied. "And we're not safe yet." We still have to make it to the police line, and 15 minutes isn't very long. Maria and Carmen moved through the network of courtyards and alleys with the desperate efficiency of people who knew their lives depended on reaching safety within the next few minutes. Each corner they turned could reveal another group of armed men, and each moment that passed brought them closer to the end of their negotiated ceasefire. The route Isabella had shown them was ingenious, threading between buildings in a way that kept them hidden from street-level observation. But Maria could hear vehicles moving in the distance, and she knew their pursuers were repositioning themselves to intercept them before they could reach the police barricade. "How much time do we have left?" Carmen whispered as they paused at the edge of a courtyard to check for threats. Maria looked at her watch. "About 8 minutes. We're halfway there." They had covered good ground, but the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. The final 3 blocks to the police line would require them to cross several main streets where they would be completely exposed. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their hidden route, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold. Helicopters were approaching. Not the distant police helicopters they had heard earlier, but something closer and more immediate. Carmen heard them too. "Are those police helicopters?" Maria listened carefully to the sound of the rotors and shook her head grimly. "I don't think so. Police helicopters sound different. These are military or private." The helicopters were getting closer, and Maria realized that their opponents had escalated their response. Whatever she was supposed to have witnessed, whatever recording she had claimed to possess, it was important enough for these men to bring in air support. "We need to find cover," Maria said, looking around the courtyard for anything that would shield them from aerial observation. They ducked under a large overhang, just as the first helicopter passed overhead. Through the gaps in their cover, Maria could see that it was black and unmarked, definitely not law enforcement. The aircraft was flying in a search pattern, moving methodically across the neighborhood. Carmen was shaking with fear and exhaustion. "They're never going to let us reach the police, are they?" Maria refused to give in to despair. "Yes, they are. We just need to be smarter than them." She studied their surroundings, looking for advantages they could exploit. The courtyard they were hiding in had several large drainage tunnels that appeared to connect to other parts of the neighborhood. If they could access the underground drainage system, they might be able to move beneath the streets without being detected. "Carmen, look at this," Maria said, pointing to one of the tunnel openings. "If these connect to the storm drain system, we might be able to travel underground." Carmen looked at the dark, narrow opening with obvious reluctance. "I don't like confined spaces any more than I like heights." "I know," Maria said gently, "but sometimes the only way out is through." The helicopter was making another pass overhead, and Maria could hear vehicles moving closer to their position. Their time was running out, and conventional routes to safety were being systematically eliminated. Maria led the way into the drainage tunnel, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The tunnel was larger than it had appeared from outside, with enough room for them to move in a crouch without having to crawl. The underground passage smelled of damp concrete and years of accumulated debris, but it was dry and structurally sound. More importantly, it was invisible to the helicopters circling overhead and the vehicles patrolling the streets. They moved through the tunnel system for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. The passages connected to a larger storm drain that ran directly beneath the main avenue where the police had established their barricade. "We're almost there," Maria whispered, seeing light ahead that indicated another access point. But as they approached the exit, Maria heard voices above them. Someone was standing directly over the drainage opening they needed to use. She motioned for Carmen to stop and listened carefully to the conversation. The voices belonged to the armed men they had been fleeing all morning. They had anticipated that Maria and Carmen might try to use the underground passages and had positioned people at the major exit points. Maria's watch showed that they had less than 3 minutes left in their negotiated ceasefire. After that, the hunt would resume with even greater intensity than before. She studied the drainage system around them and noticed that there was another passage that branched off toward what appeared to be the police perimeter. It was smaller and would require them to crawl, but it might emerge in an area that wasn't being watched. "This way," she whispered to Carmen, indicating the smaller passage. Carmen looked at the narrow opening and took a deep breath. I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's go. They crawled through the smaller passage, their clothes getting dirty and torn on the rough concrete. But Maria could see light ahead, and she could hear something that filled her with hope, the sound of police radios and official voices. They emerged from the drainage system behind a police vehicle that was parked at the edge of the barricade. Maria had never been so happy to see law enforcement officers in her life. "Help us," she called out, climbing out of the drainage opening with Carmen right behind her. The police officers immediately surrounded them, weapons drawn but pointed away from them. One of the officers, a sergeant with kind eyes and graying hair, approached them carefully. "Are you Maria Santos?" he asked. Maria nodded, surprised that they knew her name. "Isabella Martinez called us on her radio," the sergeant explained. "She told us to expect you. She also said you've had quite an adventure this morning." Maria almost laughed despite everything they had been through. That's one way to put it. Carmen collapsed against the police car, finally, allowing herself to believe they were safe. "She caught a grenade," she told the officers. "Someone threw a grenade at us, and she caught it out of the air and threw it back." The police officers exchanged glances of disbelief, but the evidence of the morning's violence was visible throughout the neighborhood. Smoke was still rising from several buildings, and the sound of helicopters continued to circle overhead. "We need to debrief you both," the sergeant said. "And we need to know everything about what you've seen and heard this morning." As Maria began to tell her story, she realized that what had started as a case of mistaken identity had become something much more significant. The men who had hunted them weren't just trying to silence a witness to some minor crime. They were part of something larger and more dangerous. Over the next several hours, as Maria and Carmen provided their statements to investigators, the full scope of the operation became clear. The armed men had been part of a sophisticated drug trafficking organization that had been using the neighborhood as a storage and distribution center. But they had made a critical mistake when they had assumed Maria was someone else. Their violent overreaction to what they thought was a security threat had drawn massive law enforcement attention to their operation. By the end of the day, dozens of arrests had been made, and a major drug network had been dismantled. Maria learned that there had indeed been a witness to the criminals' activities, a young woman named Rosa who lived in the building across from Maria's. Rosa had filmed the men moving weapons and drugs, but she had managed to escape the neighborhood before the manhunt began. The irony wasn't lost on Maria that she had been hunted all morning for a crime she didn't commit and evidence she didn't possess. But her quick thinking and athletic ability had not only saved her own life and Carmen's, but had also helped bring down a dangerous criminal organization. In the weeks that followed, Maria's story spread throughout Bogotá and beyond. The image of a physical therapist catching a grenade and throwing it back at armed criminals became a symbol of ordinary people standing up to violence and corruption. Maria returned to her work at the rehabilitation center, but she found that her experience had changed her in fundamental ways. She had discovered reserves of courage and determination she never knew she possessed, and she had learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to refuse to be a victim. Carmen became a close friend, and together they started a neighborhood watch program that helped make their community safer for everyone. Isabella received recognition for her bravery in helping them escape, and her cafe became a gathering place for people committed to making positive changes in their neighborhood. The men who had terrorized them that morning were prosecuted and convicted on multiple charges. Their organization was dismantled, and the weapons and drugs they had been moving were taken off the streets. But for Maria, the most important outcome was personal. She had faced the worst kind of fear and violence, and had not only survived but had found ways to help others. The morning that had begun with a simple jog had ended with her understanding that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Years later, when people asked Maria how she had found the courage to catch a grenade and throw it back at armed criminals, she would smile and say that she hadn't found courage at all. She had simply decided that some things were worth fighting for, and once she made that decision, everything else had followed naturally. The story of Maria Santos became a reminder that heroes aren't necessarily people with special training or extraordinary abilities. Sometimes, Heroes are just ordinary people who refuse to give up when everything seems hopeless, and who discover that the human spirit is capable of far more than anyone imagines possible. Maria never went for another morning jog in that neighborhood. But she also never forgot the lesson she had learned that day, that sometimes the most important moment of your life comes when you least expect it, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. They emerged from the passage into a courtyard behind a residential building several blocks from where their ordeal had begun. Maria could see police vehicles in the distance, but they still had to cross several streets that might be watched or patrolled. Isabella pointed toward a route that would take them through a series of connected courtyards and alleys. "This way will keep you off the main streets," she said. "My daughter is a police officer. When you reach the barricade, tell them Isabella Martinez sent you. They'll know you're telling the truth." Maria hugged the brave cafe owner who had helped them escape. "Thank you for everything. I'll make sure everyone knows how you helped us." Isabella smiled despite the stress of the situation. "Just get to safety, Mija. And maybe next time, have your coffee somewhere quieter." Maria, Carmen, and Isabella's unexpected courage had turned the tide of what could have been a massacre. But as they began their final push toward the police line, Maria knew that the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. The men hunting them would be desperate now, and desperate people were capable of anything. The next 15 minutes would determine whether Maria Santos would live to tell the incredible story of the morning she caught a grenade out of the air and threw it back at the men who had tried to kill her. Behind the counter. "But are you in some kind of trouble? Do you need me to call the police?" Before Maria could answer, the cafe door opened and 2 men entered. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their casual survey of the interior and the way they positioned themselves near the exit made it clear they weren't ordinary customers. Maria's blood turned to ice as one of the men's eyes met hers. Recognition flashed across his face, and she knew their brief sanctuary was about to become another trap. The man reached for something concealed under his jacket, and Maria realized with crystal clarity that their running was about to end. But instead of the resignation she expected to feel, a fierce determination filled her. She had come too far and fought too hard to give up now. What happened next would become the moment that defined everything that followed. The split-second decision that would transform Maria Santos from a victim into something else entirely. As the man's hand closed around whatever weapon he was drawing, Maria stood up from her chair and prepared to make a stand that would shock everyone in that cafe, including herself. The morning that had begun with a simple jog was about to become a lesson in courage that none of them would ever forget. P of a man's head appearing above the roof line. In just a few seconds, he would be on the roof and would undoubtedly spot them. It was at that moment that Maria made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to run and hide, she decided to take action. She had spent her entire life being athletic and competitive, and she wasn't going to spend what might be her last moments cowering behind an air conditioning unit. She picked up a small piece of broken concrete from the roof and prepared to make a stand. Carmen looked at her with a mixture of admiration and terror, realizing that this woman she had just met was willing to fight for both of their lives. The man's head appeared above the roof line, and Maria could see that he was armed with an automatic weapon. But she also saw something else that gave her a moment of hope. He was looking in the wrong direction, scanning the far side of the roof first. Maria knew she had maybe 3 seconds before he turned in their direction. 3 seconds to make a move that might save their lives, or end them. She gripped the piece of concrete tighter and prepared to find out which it would be. Her hiding spot. Maria allowed herself to breathe a little easier, but she knew this reprieve was temporary. She needed to find a way out of this situation, and she needed to do it quickly. As she crouched behind the maintenance shed, Maria heard the sound of vehicles moving again. The net was closing, and she was running out of options. The smart thing to do would be to stay hidden and wait for law enforcement to arrive. But something told her that might not be soon enough. She peered around the corner of the shed and saw that the coast was temporarily clear. This might be her only chance to make a break for it. Maria took one more deep breath, said a quick prayer, and prepared to run for her life. What she didn't know was that her ordeal was just beginning, and that within the next few minutes, She would find herself face to face with a situation that would test every ounce of courage and quick thinking she possessed. The morning that had started with a simple jog was about to become a test of survival that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her.